So let's talk about all that stuff in the middle. Today we're going to talk about the middle colonies, mostly New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And they have very little to do with each other, and they don't really have much in common with either New England or the Chesapeake. They don't really fit in anywhere, which is weird because they're in the middle. So if you love New York, today is a day for you. So if there is something we can say about all the middle colonies, is that one, they are very diverse. The colony in New York was actually founded by the Dutch. The colony in Pennsylvania, for example, it was actually founded by English Quakers. We'll talk more about them in just a minute. But you eventually get Quakers from all over Europe, especially Germany. So in other words, it's kind of weird because right in the middle of British North America, you have this very diverse selection of colonists. Now, if there is one other, let's say, consistency between most of these colonies, is the fact that these are proprietary colonies. These are basically colonies that have been granted to individuals. So unlike royal colonies, where the crown basically owns the colony and the crown basically allows a royal governor to rule in their stead, and unlike a joint stock company where a corporation owns a colony and investors kind of control the corporation, this is a situation where the crown almost gives the colony to a CEO kind of person. There's a reason why I put the Lizard King himself here, Mark Zuckerberg. A lot of these colonies, I think it's kind of easy to imagine them if you just think of the following dystopian nightmare scenario, which is imagine if Mark Zuckerberg had a colony. Imagine if Elon Musk, that's a little bit more imaginable, had a colony. That's kind of what these middle colonies were like, where you're not really seeing them run by corporations or the crown, just by individuals. So let's talk just a little bit about the Dutch colony in New York. We're going to bring the terms down. So the Dutch are kind of an interesting group because the Dutch are kind of like the Portuguese in the sense that they are very focused on maritime trade. The Dutch are a seafaring people. And the Dutch, by this point, by the way, have basically supplanted Portugal in terms of controlling the slave trade. So there's also kind of like let's say, the more terrible, the more horrible side of being a seafaring people. But the Dutch do establish a colony called New Amsterdam, which they purchased from the Manhattan Indians. And so that's why the location of New Amsterdam is on an island called Manhattan Island for the Manhattan Indians. Now, the colony in New York, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but the colony in New York was really based around the fur trade. And it was still very, very small. I mean, you can probably find examples of Dutch architecture in New York City today if you know where to look. But believe it or not, New York City, or let's say the center of New York City, specifically Wall Street, is the exact location that the Dutch founded their colony. So basically, they established New Amsterdam, and then they built a series of interconnected or mutually supporting forts along the Hudson River, which eventually connected to the modern-day city of Albany, where the Dutch had a fort. So the Dutch were really focused on the fur trade, very much like the French in Canada, and because of that, the Dutch had pretty decent relations with the Native Americans in the area. Generally, both the French and the Dutch had to rely upon the Native Americans in order to trap the local wildlife. So the problem with the Dutch colony in New York is that, things were actually going pretty well in Holland, which, by the way, is the main core Dutch territory. Believe it or not, during this time period, the Dutch had the highest standard of living on Earth. Remember that Columbus, was trying to find a sea-based route to Asia, so that he could basically land in Indonesia and gain access to all the spices there. Well, the thing is that the Dutch actually got there. The Dutch actually managed to colonize the East Indies, which are now called Indonesia. So compared to the immense wealth of Indonesia, what is there in New York? I mean, yeah, we all love New York, I guess, but just having a decent harbor and being able to, export some beaver fur, that's pennies, right? So the problem is that the Dutch find it very difficult to find anybody who's really interested in moving to New York. In fact, a lot of the Dutch colonists to the New World weren't actually Dutch in the first place. They were actually Finns that the Dutch basically duped into immigrating to the New World. I wish I could go into more detail about that story. It's just so bizarre. But anyway, what happens is that in the 1680s, the English decide to, actually not the 1680s, the 1660s, the English actually decide to try to come after the Dutch. So, and partially that's because the English and the Dutch are very competitive with one another. They are both maritime nations. They're both Protestant nations. And so you would think that being so similar in that respect would make them best buds, but no, it's kind of like sometimes opposites attract, and being the same kind of let's say repels people or repels countries. So the English launch a fleet led by the Duke of York in 1664, and the Dutch give up without a fight, partially because there's really nobody there to fight. A while later, the Dutch launch a revolution, or really a revolt against English rule, led by a guy named Peter Stuyvesant. But eventually the English, so when the Dutch rise up, down goes the English flag, up goes the Dutch flag, and then the English come and retake New York again. Down goes the Dutch flag, up goes the English flag, the Union Jack. So it just kind of lets you know just how juvenile some of these early colonial wars could be. It is so small scale and limited. So eventually, after that, I guess second time was the charm for the English. And after the English take it that second time, the New York, or sorry, the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam is called New York after King Charles II's brother, James, the Duke of York. And so from this point onward, you have this really interesting situation in New York where basically the Dutch, let's say, elites called poltroons, that's Poltroons, are still very influential. They still go to Dutch Reformed churches. They're still Calvinist churches, by the way, but not like the Puritan churches. So what's kind of interesting about this is that the Dutch kind of assimilate into the British Empire pretty easily, but they still kind of maintain their own customs as well. You still see examples of Dutch architecture in New York City, if you know where to look. And you also, some of these Dutch poltroons actually are very influential and very powerful. You have heard of some of these Dutch families, by the way, because these Dutch families sometimes form powerful dynasties. So I can't hope that you've heard of Martin Van Buren, but maybe you've heard of Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Roosevelt family is basically descended by these original Dutch poltroons. So, let's say that the Dutch are still kind of, at least the Dutch legacy is still very influential in a variety of ways. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and go from talking about the Dutch in New York to The origin of the Quakers. This is the origin story of the Quaker Oatmeal Man, by the way. So, the Quakers are yet another religious group that are being persecuted by the English, and they're seeking, a safe haven in the New World. Now, I love the Quakers, so I'm going to try not to talk too much about them. But let me tell you a little bit about the origin of the Quakers. So, um, the Quakers kind of emerge as a byproduct of the English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War was absolutely devastating. It killed something like 5 to 7% of the population in England. And just for comparison's sake, I mean, that's roughly equal to the number of people who die in the American Civil War. I mean, civil wars are really terrible, no matter if they are of the American or the English variety, right? And sometimes what happens in these civil wars is that you have religious consequences where people sort of look inwards to try to figure out how can you explain all of this unnecessary slaughter. And the other part of this is that, remember, the English Civil War is, in some respects, it's a religious civil war. Um, you know, okay, so spoiler, in our Civil War, at the very least, it was very bloody, but at the very least, people could kind of console themselves with the fact that the American Civil War at least saw the end of slavery, right? The English Civil War, though, is not one of those conflicts, because at the very end, at the end of the day, in the 1660s, the monarchy comes back anyway. So the question is, I mean, what was it all for? So it's those kinds of questions that cause people to turn towards religion, especially when arguably organized religion played a role in the war itself. And George Fox is this young, intellectually brilliant student who is disturbed at all the carnage he observes during the English Civil War. And nobody has really been able to give him a good explanation for how God could allow this to happen. And the more he asks people, the less the less satisfied he is. So George Fox kind of has almost like this Siddhartha-like experience where he wanders the country and sort of looks inward. And apparently, while traveling through prayer and meditation, he discovers his inner light and communes directly with the Holy Spirit. And that experience becomes kind of like the beginning of the Quaker faith. Though, to be honest, the Quaker faith wasn't called the Quaker faith at first. Quakers at first called themselves the Society of Friends. And let me tell you a little bit about what they believe. So the Quakers are militant pacifists. That's kind of a contradiction, but I think that's probably the best way to describe them. And to be honest, it's a religion that kind of emerges logically after the carnage of the English Civil War. So after a really horrible Civil War, it kind of stands to reason that some people would want to reject all forms of violence. On the other hand, if you remember that Oliver Cromwell guy, Puritan dictator person, kind of had a reputation for being cranky and intolerant towards other non-Puritans. If you're a Quaker, maybe Puritan rule in England makes you a little uncomfortable. And so maybe it was a savvy move to advertise the fact that your religion refuses to practice or to condone any form of violence. It's kind of like the equivalent of saying you wouldn't hit a guy with glasses, would you? But here's the thing. Quakers believed in nonviolence because they were radical egalitarians. They believed that everyone had an inner light, potentially. That life was sacred. And this meant that it didn't matter if you were a commoner, the king, or a slave, that everybody was equal in God's eyes. And so when you make that assumption, that takes you into some radical places, actually. So if everybody is equal, then what right does somebody have to lead a Quaker service? Well, apparently nobody. So if you know anything about Quaker services, they usually involve, I mean, I haven't actually seen one either. This is just what I've read about, and maybe one day I'll be able to go and actually watch one. From what I've heard, they're basically these services in which people gather together and quietly meditate and try to commune with the Holy Spirit, apparently. So it's just like this very different type of religious worship, but it's founded on this very radical political doctrine that everybody is equal in some way, shape, or form. Um, well, what? Let's explore that everybody. So it means that slaves are equal, and by the way, this is why many Southerners, especially we'll talk about this when we talk about Barbados, but there were some Quakers who were actually put to death on the island of Barbados because they tried to convert slaves. The Quakers were some of the very first abolitionists. Now, the other question is, what about women? Because we've talked about the fact that women, especially with the story of Anne Hutchinson, that women were basically treated as second-class citizens. Well, the thing is that just because your religion says everybody is equal, doesn't mean that people necessarily buy it. Sometimes people have very selective reading when it comes to religion. Well, what would happen, though, is that female Quakers would crash these Quaker church services and yell and scream at the top of their lungs. And the male Quakers would say, "Get out, leave." And the female Quakers would be like, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" Well, if it were any other denomination, if it was, for example, the Puritans would say, "Well, let me show you what we'll do about it." But if you're a Quaker and you don't believe in violence, well, what can you do about it? And they realized they couldn't do anything. And so, reluctantly, but permanently, women were allowed to participate and take up leadership roles in Quaker congregations, to the extent that anybody, I guess, can be a leader in Quaker denominations. So, that being said, because they were against any and all authority and hierarchy, basically Quakers were, I mean, this is not really an exaggeration, hated by everybody. The first Quakers arrived in Massachusetts in 1656. And as soon as they arrived, basically they were sent back, banished. And later Quakers who arrived sometimes had their ears boxed, which meant that, basically they had chunks of their ears taken out, and some were eventually killed. According to the Puritans, not sure if I said this, the Quakers were basically witches. And even somebody as tolerant as Roger Williams, who agreed that slavery was wrong, that tried to do, to basically treat Native Americans as his equals, even he was frustrated by the Quakers because the Quakers just, just intestinally opposed any and all forms of authority or hierarchy. By the way, it's one of the reasons why the Quakers called themselves the Society of Friends. Because they would never address somebody by, like, for example, if they were talking to the king, they wouldn't say "Your Majesty." They wouldn't call somebody by a noble title. There's no "my lord" or "my lady" or anything. It's "friend." And we might think, "Oh, well, that's kind of nice. You're my friend. Friendship is magical." But no, like, calling somebody friend in that respect is kind of passive aggressive. You're like, you're nobody. Like, you're just a buddy, maybe. So, in other words, let's say the crown really wanted the Quakers gone in some way, shape, or form. Now, I think I mentioned there's quiet, spontaneous testimony called everybody friend. Women could be religious leaders, again, to the extent that leaders were a thing at all in Quaker services. I should also point out, though, that because the Quakers believed that everybody was equal, this is why they dressed in this very plain, drab clothing. So again, because they assume that everybody is equal, that takes them to very extreme positions at times. Now, we mentioned that Quakers were punished harshly by the Puritans. Some were hanged. Some were tried for heresy, and then they had their skin branded with an H, H for heretic. So the Quakers, I mean, if you think about that, the Quakers are trying to find places of religious sanctuary. And so they go to places like Massachusetts Bay, because Massachusetts Bay was created for free exercise of religion. And then, lo and behold, what they found out, much like what you guys have found out, is that Massachusetts Bay doesn't guarantee freedom of all religious worship, just Puritan religious worship. So what happens is that there's this interest in finding a safe haven for Quakers. And that's where we introduce Mr. William Penn, or also known as William Pennsylvania. This is where the state of Pennsylvania comes from. So William Penn had a dad who was very wealthy and also well connected. His dad was an admiral in the Royal Navy. If you know anything about British history, you know they take that kind of thing pretty seriously. But if you also know anything about King Charles II, pictured here on the left, King Charles II was somebody who liked to live, it actually took me a few minutes to think of the term, in something that would be suitable for a G-rated audience. So Charles II liked to make merry. There was a reason why they called him the Merry Monarch, but it meant that he liked to party. He had a lot of mistresses. He liked to live life on the edge, on the extremes. And that, of course, got really expensive. And so Charles II went to William Penn's father and asked him for a loan. And William Penn's father said yes, because he reasoned, not unreasonably, that, having the king in your debt might come in handy. So eventually, William Penn's father dies, and that right to collect on his father's debt passes to him. Now, William Penn is kind of from the upper crust of British society. He's a noble, he's the son of an admiral, he is university educated, he goes to Oxford, but apparently while he's at Oxford, he is converted to the Quaker cause. And we tend to think it has to be genuine, because the Quakers generally, if everybody is supposed to be equal, well then why would a rich person want to be a Quaker? So at some level, we kind of feel like William Penn actually was just genuinely converted based upon the merits, because it's very rare to find members of the nobility who convert to Quakerism. Now, that being said, maybe if William Penn was anybody else, that would be the beginning of a tragedy, because we've already talked about the fact that the Quakers were mistreated and persecuted by just about everybody. But Charles II still had a lot of affection for Penn's father, and William Penn also feels like he can almost play the role of knight in shining armor and help his followers. So William Penn requests a colony in the New World, that can be used as a center of religious refuge for his college, for the Quakers. And Charles II agrees, but things get off to kind of a shaky start. Because you might wonder, why would Quakers, who are not big on ostentatious displays, why would they agree to settle in a colony named after William Penn? I mean, that's a little presumptuous, don't you think? Um, well, apparently the reason for that is that when William Penn asked for land, a land grant so he could establish a colony in Pennsylvania, Charles II said, "Oh, I held your father in such esteem that, I think it would be a smashing idea if we named the colony after your father." And William Penn is like, "Your Majesty, I appreciate this, but can we not?" And Charles II goes, "No, I insist." And when the king insists, well, that's all there is to it. But this means that instead of being a knight in shining armor, the savior of his fate, a lot of the Quakers give him the stink eye, thinking that this is basically going to be a vanity project for William Penn. Just kind of a way to toot his own horn to a certain extent. So, William Penn establishes a colony in Pennsylvania, and between 1682 to 1685, over 8,000 people immigrate. Now, one of the advantages that Penn has is the fact that at this point, it's been almost 75 years since the establishment of Jamestown. And Jamestown kind of gave William Penn and a lot of the other English colonists, just to be honest, basically a manual on what not to do. So in other words, a lot of the colonies that are established later on, like towards the end of the 1600s, they do much better because at this point the English have learned many hard and difficult lessons. So it means that you have a lot of people immigrating all at once, and it also means that the people who immigrate don't really have those horror stories of death and starvation that you hear about in the Chesapeake or even the New English. Partially, this is also because, again, William Penn is a Quaker. He believes in equality and he believes in nonviolence. So what that means is that, well, even if he wanted to, let's say, eliminate some local Native American tribes, he was held back by his religion. So the people of Pennsylvania actually form a pretty close relationship with the neighboring Native American tribes. And any land that's taken by the Quakers is purchased outright. So speaking of which, if you remember the other name for the Quakers, the Society of Friends, the main city of Pennsylvania is the city of Philadelphia. And if you know your Greek, you might know that that means the city of brotherly love, which is maybe one of the most Quaker names you could ever imagine, I think. So again, you have 8,000 people by about 1685. Then you have around 11,000 by 1690, and then 18,000 by 1700. So, in other words, the colony of Pennsylvania kind of lags behind because it comes in at the end of this colonial era to a certain extent. But at the same time, it catches up very, very quickly. So the colony itself mostly consisted of artisans and farmers. It's mostly middle-class people who immigrate to Pennsylvania. And so basically the role of Pennsylvania economically is that it is the main source of wheat throughout the colonies, and also because of its location, because it's located along navigable waterways, the city of Philadelphia itself becomes, a major trading hub. So, for example, let's say that you're a merchant in Massachusetts and you want to send some goods for sale to the Chesapeake. Well, very often those goods would pass through Philadelphia. So basically, Pennsylvania kind of becomes a trade hub for all the colonies. Now, um, the Quakers were also you kind of get the impression that they were bummed out by the fact that the Puritans said they were all about freedom of religion, but when it actually counted, kind of kicked them to the curb, and in some cases just outright executed them. So the colony of Pennsylvania actually guarantees freedom of religion for everyone so long as they were Christian. And even then, they kind of fudged it a little bit and pretty much allowed most anybody to immigrate to the colony. So what happens, though, is that Pennsylvania becomes a center not just for the Quaker movement, but it becomes kind of like this refuge for people of all different religions. You have, for example, Anabaptists in Germany, called the Amish, a group that is still, we kind of are familiar with today. The Anabaptists and these other religious groups come principally from Germany. And so what happens is that, believe it or not, Pennsylvania is not only going to be a source of immigration for English Quakers, but also Germans and other non-English colonists. So other thing is that if you look at the laws in Pennsylvania, kind of like the Puritans, they did have laws against things like public drunkenness, rejecting the Sabbath, fornication. I mean, the laws kind of looked imposing, or let's say it did kind of look strict. But again, the problem is that if you are a Quaker colony and somebody breaks Quaker rules, what are you going to do about it? And the answer is nothing. So, in other words, you just don't have any way to kind of, let's say, enforce Quaker morality. So eventually what happens is that even though the colony is supposed to be established for the Quaker faith, it quickly loses its religious character to a certain extent, or at least its Quaker character. Again, let's talk a little bit about the city of Philadelphia specifically. We said it's a center of commerce. It's situated on navigable rivers. But within just 2 years of its founding, it grows to a population of 2,500 people, which is actually pretty extraordinary. And one of the reasons it's able to do this is, if you look at the layout of the city, you notice something about it. Look at those beautiful lines. Like, one of the things that's instantly apparent is the fact that they actually thought about how to plan the city. That's not the way cities are usually designed, because cities aren't usually designed. So, for example, take a look at Boston. Who wants to get lost there? Because cities like Boston grow organically and slowly over time without really, a plan or a map. Most cities don't, aren't planned, but Philadelphia was. And one of the reasons why that's important is that in an age before sewage, a lot of times in cities, people would just kind of take their bathroom waste and dump it in the street. And multiply that by a few thousand people, and you can kind of get a sense of how dangerous and deadly disease could be. Fortunately, the city of Philadelphia was spread out enough that it kind of prevented the spread of too much disease, which sometimes happens when you have people living in close proximity. So I want to talk a little bit about the government that Penn established in Pennsylvania. So theoretically, you had a governor. Oh, by the way, who was Penn? I mean, there have to be perks to being, having a proprietary colony, right? You get to be the guy in charge. But then there was also a provincial assembly, which later becomes the General's Assembly of Pennsylvania. And the thing is that, again, how do you think Quakers feel about governors? Well, they don't like governors because, again, having a governor means that basically there's somebody put in a position of authority over you. Also, by the way, Pennsylvania doesn't have a bicameral legislature. If you remember your civics, bicameral legislature means that you have an upper house and a lower house. Well, if you have like a Senate, an upper house, how do you think the Quakers are going to view that? They're not going to like it because having an upper house means that there's literally somebody or something above you. So what this meant is that William Penn finds it very difficult to govern the colony effectively. It's also not helped by the fact that he only spends about 44 years in the colony itself. And the provincial assembly has the power to veto everything and anything William Penn does. So what happens for poor William Penn is that despite all his trouble of trying to create a good colony, and by the way, he does actually create a good colony. I mean, if you look at its origin story, there's no horrific death either of the colonists or of Native Americans. Nobody really starves. Like, he puts together a good colony, and he dies penniless. The effort bankrupts him, and the Quaker population doesn't really show him any thanks. Not that I'm saying they should, by the way, but at the same time, what a sad end for William Penn. He does get some degree of immortality, though, because apparently there are some people who argue that William Penn's face is the inspiration for the Quaker oatmeal man. So, just think about that whenever you feel sorry for William Penn. So, we've established the middle colonies, and hopefully, if you get nothing else, you get a sense of how diverse they are. And by the way, that diversity is only going to increase as we turn to the Deep South next time.